Hey guys, it's Landon from RH and On Point Workshops. This is another fantastic Surveyor Short. It's where you stop scrolling in your social media feed, actually learn something for a couple minutes from a ruggedly handsome land surveyor. Today, we're going to answer another question. What is the Public Land Survey System? If you aren't married to or related to a land surveyor, you may have never heard that term, Public Land Survey System. What is that? We're going to answer that question. The Public Land Survey System is a system to consistently survey and describe land. It was used in most of the western United States, so almost all of the states west of the Mississippi River, few of the states east of the Mississippi River. Almost all of those states, almost all of the land in those states was surveyed as part of this system, and it's basically a 1 mile by 1 mile grid that surveyors put on the ground to define land ownership boundaries. So we're going to answer two quick questions about the Public Land Surveyor System. Public Land Survey System, we call it the PLSS for short. Answer two questions about the PLSS. How was the grid created on the ground, and why is this thing important? Like, never heard of it. Why is the PLSS important to land surveyors? So let's start with that first question. How was the grid created? So basically in every state west of the Mississippi, they would pick one point. Very special point called the initial point, and they would set a monument there. In California, our initial point is, well, we have three. We have one up in the mountains by Humboldt. We have one down by San Bernardino, but the main initial point for most of California is at the top of Mount Diablo in the San Francisco Bay Area. You can actually go see it. I have never done that. I'm ashamed. I've been here more than 20 years and I haven't been to see my initial point yet, but it's sitting there. It's in the rock on top of Mount Diablo. So they would pick an initial point. And then they would survey two lines from the initial point. They would go due north and due south on what was called the prime meridian for miles and miles and miles. And then they would go east and west along what was called the baseline for miles and miles and miles in as straight a line as they could survey. So that was the second step. First step, set an initial point. Second step, survey north, south, east, west of that point. That's kind of like the axis of the grid. And then they would go every 24 miles and they would survey east and west on a line, and they would go every other 24 miles, and they would survey north and south. And so they would, those north-south lines were called guide meridians, and the east-west lines were called standard parallels. So now we have a grid that's basically 24 miles by 24 miles, right? Then they would take those squares that were 24 miles by 24 miles, and they would divide those into what's called townships. Townships are 6 miles by 6 miles. So you'd get that 24 mile by 24 mile area, and that would be divided into 36 townships? No, I'm sorry. It was 24 miles, be divided into four townships by 4 townships. So 16 townships. That's called a quadrangle. So now we have a grid that's essentially 6 miles by 6 miles. Then they would take each township, would get subdivided into what we call sections. Those are the 1 mile by 1 mile squares. Those are called sections. So those were the steps. Initial point, prime meridian baseline, guide meridians and standard parallels, township boundaries, townships divided into sections. That's how we get the 1 mile by 1 mile grid. And it's pretty impressive. It's an amazing system. Some very smart surveyors came up with that system a long, long time ago. It's a really fascinating and amazing system. I don't know that there's any other system like it in the world. And it's pretty amazing what they did. Most of those surveys were done in the 1800s, a few in the early 1900s, but a lot of it was done in the 1800s. And they were using what we call a transit, and they were pulling a steel chain or tape measure and using a compass, and they were on horseback. It was just amazing what they surveyed. They basically surveyed the whole western United States with very primitive tools. It was very impressive what they did. They also drank a lot of whiskey, which is understandable. Okay, so that brings us to the second question. Why is the Public Land Survey System important? Why is it important to land surveyors? Why is it important to you? So one reason is it influences land ownership and land use patterns in the United States. Depending on where you're at, if you look at satellite photography, you can actually see that 1 mile by 1 mile grid kind of etched into the surface of the earth, because it controls land use and land ownership patterns. The Public Land Survey System also determines the rules that govern boundary surveying and land title when you're inside that system, which I mentioned is most of the western United States. So here in Central California, when I'm not in a Mexican land grant, I'm following the rules of the Public Land Survey System. I meant to bring you guys, we have a rule book. It's called the BLM Manual Surveying Instructions. I forgot to grab it, but it's a pretty thick book. So there's a lot of rules. It's a complicated system. So it's very important to us as land surveyors. The Public Land Survey System also influences the units of measurement that we use to describe land, distance and area. So for example, it's where we get the acre from. That's based on the Public Land Survey System. So if you work in real estate in ways you probably don't even realize, your work is connected to this underlying grid, this 1 mile by 1 mile grid that was surveyed in the 1800s by these incredibly tough, ruggedly handsome, possibly alcoholic land surveyors. It's an amazing system, and it undergrids a huge amount of the real estate in the western United States. I did pause my camera, and I went and grabbed you guys the book just so you could see it. This is actually the 1973 version. There's a newer version from 2009 that we got laying around here somewhere, but it's a fairly thick book. So this is the rule book that we use when we're surveying in the Public Land Survey System. So there's a lot to learn here. It's a fascinating part, historical part of boundary surveying in the United States. So there you go. Now you know all about the Public Land Survey System. Quiz your friends with some useless surveying dinner trivia now that you've picked up from your favorite ruggedly handsome land surveyor. And we will catch you on the next Fantastic Surveyor Short.